James Miller was not a man of extravagance, nor was he one for crowds and high society events. He didn't have the sharp suit, the pristine shoes, or the confident air that oozed from the men and women who frequented the city's most exclusive restaurants. His life was simple, grounded in modesty. A man of routine, he worked tirelessly as a mechanic at a local garage, where his hands were always covered in grease. His mind focused on solving the complex problems of broken engines, and his heart full of quiet ambition. At 35, James had never tasted the luxury that so many others took for granted. His paycheck barely covered his bills, and there was never any room for anything extra. No vacations, no dinners out, no designer clothing. But James wasn't bothered by this. His life had always been about doing what was necessary, helping others when he could, and living a life that, while simple, was honest. Yet, there was a fire inside him, a dream that he kept hidden from the world. James longed for something more, not for the sake of wealth or status, but for a sense of control over his own destiny. He had always believed that if the world would only notice him for his worth, he could rise above the daily grind. But for now, he simply kept his head down, focused on making ends meet. That all changed on the night of his birthday. It was meant to be a quiet, solitary evening, a small dinner at home. But a chance encounter with an old friend, now a successful business executive, led to an unexpected invitation. His friend, Richard, had become a regular patron of a luxurious upscale restaurant, the kind where celebrities, high-profile business people, and socialites dined. It was a place James had only ever seen in movies. He had never imagined himself stepping inside its polished marble floors or sitting at its gleaming tables. But Richard insisted, "Come on, it's your birthday, you deserve it." James hesitated, but after some convincing, he found himself at the door of Le Fleur de Paris, a restaurant renowned for its exclusive clientele and exquisite cuisine. It was a world so far removed from James's own that he didn't know what to expect, only that he was trying to step outside his own boundaries for once. His outfit was humble, a basic collared shirt and worn jeans, far from the tailored suits or designer dresses worn by the others. James felt out of place from the moment he entered. The hostess greeted him with a slight but polite smile, but her eyes subtly glanced at his attire, the same way someone might look at a stray dog on a busy street. The atmosphere was elegant and cold, where every corner boasted extravagance, golden chandeliers, white linen tablecloths, and crystal wine glasses. As he sat down at the table, he tried to ignore the discomfort rising in his chest. This wasn't his world, and he knew it. Then came the waiter, tall, impeccably dressed, with an air of superiority that seemed to radiate from him. His name tag read Alistair, and his demeanor was one of cold professionalism, as though he was used to serving only the elite. Alistair barely acknowledged James as he placed the menu on the table. The waiter's eyes flicked to James's clothes, then to the rest of the dining room, before offering a small, tight-lipped smile that felt more condescending than welcoming. "Anything I can recommend, sir?" Alistair asked, his voice dripping with politeness, but his eyes betraying judgment. James, trying to remain composed, glanced at the menu. He didn't know much about fine dining, let alone the expensive dishes that adorned the pages. He was an ordinary man in an extraordinary place, and every part of him felt it. I'll just have the house special," James replied, his voice almost a whisper. Alistair nodded, but his eyes lingered a moment too long on James's humble attire before turning away, clearly already moving on to the next guest. James could feel the weight of judgment in the air, as if his presence there was a mistake, a disruption to the high-class atmosphere. It didn't take long for James to feel the sting of the waiter's dismissal. Alistair, having taken James's order, made no effort to engage him further, giving the man a dismissive glance. The kind of glance you might give a person whose presence was an inconvenience, a person who didn't belong. But what James didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that this night would soon turn on its head in the most unexpected and dramatic way. The setting was grand, to say the least. Le Fleur de Paris was an institution in the city, a restaurant that had become synonymous with wealth, status, and exclusivity. Nestled on the top floor of a towering skyscraper, it offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, which twinkled like a sea of stars under the velvet night sky. The interior was an opulent masterpiece. White marble floors that gleamed with an ethereal glow, tables adorned with fine china and polished silverware, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering lights below. Soft classical music floated through the air, adding to the refined atmosphere. Every corner of the restaurant exuded perfection: the polished glasses, the glistening silverware, the carefully orchestrated movements of the waitstaff, all choreographed to create an atmosphere of exclusivity and perfection. It was a world where only the chosen few were allowed to dine, where the smell of gourmet food mingled with the air of unattainable luxury. The guests seated at the surrounding tables wore designer outfits, their laughter and conversations laced with the language of the elite. To James, this world felt alien, a place where his modest upbringing seemed like a glaring mark of distinction. But he was determined to enjoy the night, despite the nagging sense of discomfort. After all, he was here to celebrate his birthday, even if he wasn't quite sure he belonged. The restaurant's staff moved with efficiency, each one a silent performer in a well-rehearsed ballet of service. And then there was Alistair, who seemed to float from table to table, his eyes constantly scanning for the next guest to please, the next tip to earn, and the next moment to maintain the illusion that wealth was synonymous with superiority. It didn't take long for the tension to escalate. As the evening went on, the discomfort James felt only deepened. He tried to engage in small talk with Richard, but the restaurant's atmosphere was so intimidating, so foreign, that he couldn't shake the feeling that every eye in the room was on him. He felt the sting of judgment every time Alistair walked past, as if the waiter was measuring him up, silently deeming him unworthy of the space he occupied. James tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every little action from the staff felt like an unwelcome reminder of his place. When James asked for water, Alistair didn't even look him in the eye, simply pouring the glass with a quick flick of the wrist. When he made a request for a change in his dish, it was met with a brief, condescending smile. But it wasn't until the incident with the wine that everything changed. James, unsure of the intricacies of wine etiquette, hesitated when Alistair offered the wine list. He looked at the list with uncertainty, not recognizing a single name. He couldn't even pronounce half of them. Trying to avoid embarrassment, he simply pointed to a random wine, hoping it would suffice. "Ah, La Grande Réserve, sir," Alistair said with a raised eyebrow, his tone sharp and dismissive. "A fine choice for someone like you." The words cut deep, but James didn't react immediately. He stayed quiet, but Richard, noticing the change in the air, looked at the waiter and then at James, trying to diffuse the situation with a nervous laugh. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Alistair had crossed a line, and James, still trying to remain composed, felt his blood boil. The waiter's insult was so casual, so blatant, that it struck at the very core of James's self-worth. This wasn't just about bad service. It was about the waiter's belief that James didn't belong here, that a man like him from his world could never understand the refinement of the elite. James sat back in his chair, staring at his plate, a storm of emotions swirling inside. Anger, hurt, shame. But beneath it all, a deep, hidden feeling began to stir, a feeling that he was no longer going to let this moment define him. Something inside him snapped, but not in the way anyone would expect, because this night was about to turn into something entirely different. James had never felt like this before. His pulse was racing, and the knot in his stomach tightened with every passing second. He tried to stay composed, trying to convince himself that he could make it through the evening without letting the waiter's condescension ruin his night. But deep down, the insults hurt. They weren't just about his appearance or his choice of wine. Those were superficial jabs. What hurt more was the cold, almost imperceptible way that Alistair had made him feel inferior. Like he didn't belong in a place like Le Fleur de Paris. It was the unspoken judgment in Alistair's eyes that cut deeper than any words ever could. It was as if the waiter saw James not as a person, but as an inconvenience, someone who shouldn't even be allowed to breathe the same air as those around him. James knew that the restaurant wasn't meant for people like him. It was a playground for the rich, the successful, the ones who had everything they wanted, except respect for people like him. He could already see how the other guests were eyeing him, their glances quick and dismissive. Even Richard, his old friend, seemed to be retreating into his own world, caught up in the luxury of the place. Here was no real connection. James was an outsider in a world of insiders, and he was beginning to feel it down to his very core. The meal went on in uncomfortable silence. Alistair continued to serve with a professionalism that veiled his disdain. James tried to ignore him, trying to focus on his food, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every moment felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. And then it happened. Alistair returned to their table with a flourish, his smile now one of thinly veiled mockery. "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" he asked, with a voice dripping with false sweetness, his eyes gleaming with a knowing superiority. James felt a sudden rush of anger surge through him. He could no longer keep the floodgates closed. The quiet rage inside him had been building since the moment he entered the restaurant, and now it threatened to burst forth in a torrent. He opened his mouth, prepared to lash out with words he would regret, but Richard's hand landed gently on his arm, stopping him. "James, please, let it go," Richard whispered, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. But James couldn't let it go. Not anymore. Not when the insult had been so blatant, so dismissive. It wasn't just about the waiter. It was about the entire system of privilege that surrounded him, that allowed people like Alistair to treat others with such contempt. It was about the world that had always looked down on people like him, and he was done being quiet about it. "I don't appreciate the way you're speaking to me," James said, his voice low but firm. Alistair's eyes widened in surprise, but only for a moment. He quickly regained his composure, his mouth twisting into a thin smile. "I'm simply trying to ensure your dining experience is enjoyable, sir. I meant no offense." But James wasn't fooled. He could see it in Alistair's eyes, the mocking superiority, the unspoken belief that he was better. And that was enough. "You're not fooling anyone," James shot back, his voice gaining strength. "You think just because I don't wear a suit and tie that I don't deserve to be here, but I'm just as much of a person as you, Alistair." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at the feet of the waiter. For a moment, the restaurant seemed to fall silent. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and murmured conversations faded into the background as all eyes turned to their table. James could feel the heat of the moment, but he didn't back down. He was done being silent. Alistair's face hardened, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed irritation. But before he could respond, Richard cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the situation. "James, let's just eat. It's not worth it," Richard said, his voice laced with unease. But James didn't want to let it go. He couldn't. He had spent his whole life letting things slide, letting people walk all over him. But this was different. This wasn't just about a waiter being rude. This was about standing up for himself, about making sure that for once, he wasn't invisible. As the tension between James and Alistair simmered, the evening grew even more uncomfortable. The once elegant atmosphere now felt suffocating. James could feel the judgment of the other diners like a weight on his shoulders, their eyes no longer just glancing, but lingering, as if they too were waiting for something to break. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and for the first time in his life, James felt entirely out of place. He tried to calm himself, telling himself that it didn't matter, it was just a dinner. He wasn't going to let some condescending waiter ruin his evening, but as the minutes passed, James couldn't ignore the feeling of being small, insignificant in a world that didn't seem to have any room for someone like him. It wasn't just Alistair anymore. It was everyone. The staff, the other diners, even Richard. James felt as though he were shrinking before their very eyes, his presence in the restaurant no more than a fleeting inconvenience. Finally, Alistair returned to their table, this time with a bottle of wine that James had never even ordered. The waiter set the bottle down with a flourish, his fingers brushing the neck of the bottle as though it were a prized possession. "I've brought a bottle of our finest red," Alistair announced, his voice dripping with patronizing sweetness. "I trust you'll enjoy it, sir." James could feel the smugness in Alistair's tone, the way he spoke to him as though he were beneath notice. But what stung the most wasn't the wine, it was the belief that Alistair had the power to humiliate him, to make him feel like he was invisible. Before James could say anything, Richard leaned in, whispering urgently, "James, just let it go. He's trying to get under your skin." But James could no longer hold back the torrent of emotions that had been building inside him. His pride, his frustration, his years of feeling invisible, everything came rushing to the surface. He stood up abruptly, startling the surrounding tables with his sudden movement. "Is this how you treat everyone, Alistair?" James asked, his voice rising. "Just because I don't look like you, I'm supposed to be ignored, belittled?" The room fell silent once again. Alistair's face flushed with anger, and for the first time, James saw a crack in his composed exterior. "Sir, you will not speak to me that way," Alistair hissed, his voice cold and venomous. But James wasn't backing down now. The anger inside him had taken over, and the words poured out, fueled by years of silent resentment. "You think you're better than me, that just because I don't have a $1,000 suit and a fancy car, I don't belong in this restaurant? Well, let me tell you something, Alistair. You're wrong." Alistair's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret speaking to me like that." But James didn't care anymore. His fists clenched, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The storm inside him had reached its peak, and he was done running from it. The moment was charged with an intensity that could not be ignored. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a battle for respect, for dignity, and for self-worth. And as James looked around the room, at the people who had been watching with mild interest, he realized something that hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a waiter. This was about the entire system of class, privilege, and inequality that had shaped his life. It wasn't just one man treating him like dirt. It was an entire world telling him he didn't matter. At that moment, something inside James shifted. The years of suppressed anger, the years of being ignored, all of it came to a head, and he made a decision that would change everything. The night was about to take a dramatic turn. The evening had reached its peak of tension, and everything felt as if it were hanging by a fragile thread. The stillness that had overtaken the restaurant was deafening. James stood in front of Alistair, every ounce of his being tense with anticipation. The verbal clash had stirred the atmosphere into something almost electric. Alistair's smirk was gone, replaced with a cold, calculating stare. James's heart pounded, his fists clenched tightly, but his mind raced faster than his heart could beat. What now? James could feel the shift within himself. Something was changing. The humiliation, the years of being underestimated, the sting of rejection from every corner of society, all of it came crashing down in a single, pivotal moment. Alistair had insulted him, humiliated him, but in doing so had also awakened something within him that had long remained dormant, the strength to fight back. For a second, James felt vulnerable, exposed, but it was the anger that gave him strength. It was the same anger he'd felt growing up in a small apartment, the same fire that had propelled him through years of late nights at work, the same determination that had driven him to build a career from nothing. Tonight, he realized, he wasn't going to let himself be the victim anymore. He wasn't going to let Alistair or anyone else decide what he could or could not be. And then, as though the universe was aligning, a strange, unexpected opportunity presented itself. The moment James had been dreading, being escorted out of the restaurant in disgrace, was imminent. But in that instant, something remarkable happened. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the door open and a figure stepped inside. The man, dressed in a sharp black suit, exuded an air of authority. The atmosphere seemed to shift with his entrance. Everyone in the restaurant went silent, almost instinctively. Even Alistair seemed to freeze for a moment. The newcomer's presence was magnetic, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The man made his way to the maitre d', and after a brief exchange, he turned his attention toward James. There was something familiar about his gaze, an understanding, a recognition. For a split second, James felt as if he was staring at his own reflection, but he quickly dismissed the thought. "Is there a problem here?" The man's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable authority in it. James, still standing, eyes locked on Alistair, said nothing. He didn't know what to say. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the weight of his emotions overwhelming him. The entire restaurant was watching, waiting for him to make a move. Alistair, trying to regain control of the situation, opened his mouth to speak. But before he could say anything, the man in the suit raised his hand, silencing him. "James." The stranger spoke his name, and it hit James like a lightning bolt. He knew this man. The stranger smiled, an expression full of warmth and recognition. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" James was stunned, his mind racing. He knew the man. He couldn't place him right away, but the voice was too familiar. The face, slightly older but unmistakable. The realization hit him like a freight train. This was Michael Sinclair, the CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, the one person who had always been a source of admiration and inspiration for James. The very person who had once given James an internship years ago, the man who had changed the trajectory of his life with a single decision. James's throat went dry, and for a brief moment, he felt as if the room was spinning. "Michael Sinclair," James whispered under his breath. Michael nodded. "I thought it was you. It's good to see you again, James." The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted once more, but this time it was one of quiet awe. James, still stunned, took a step forward, but his mind was racing. He had no idea what this meant, why Michael Sinclair was here, or why he had recognized him in the first place. But one thing was clear: this was no coincidence. Alistair, still standing behind the bar, was visibly uncomfortable. He'd been caught off guard. The tension in the air became palpable as he tried to regain his composure. "Mr. Sinclair, sir, I wasn't aware you were a guest tonight. Is everything all right?" Michael's gaze hardened, and for a brief second, James saw a flicker of something cold in his eyes. It was a look that sent a chill down his spine. "Everything's fine, Alistair," Michael said, his voice sharp, cutting through the air. "But I do believe there's been a misunderstanding." Alistair faltered. He knew who Michael Sinclair was. Every elite in the city knew who he was. But it was clear that he hadn't expected this turn of events. James could see the shift in his demeanor as he realized the man before him was not someone to be trifled with. I think you should apologize to my friend, Michael continued, his voice smooth but firm. James, still reeling from the surprise, finally found his voice. You don't have to do this, Michael. I can handle it. Michael's eyes softened slightly, and he gave James a nod. I know, but this is about more than just tonight. It's about respect. As Alistair stood there, unsure of what to do, James felt the atmosphere in the room begin to change. The power dynamic had shifted. The man who had once been just a visitor, a person trying to blend into a world that didn't quite accept him, was suddenly standing at the very center of the universe. Michael Sinclair's presence was the key that unlocked a door James hadn't even known existed. Alistair's eyes darted nervously from Michael to James, but he could no longer maintain the arrogant stance he'd held just moments ago. The once unshakable maître d', the one who had treated James like he was invisible, was now on the defensive. His earlier confidence had evaporated. In the span of mere minutes, the entire power structure of the restaurant had changed. What had been an overwhelming display of privilege and superiority was now a fragile construct teetering on the edge of collapse. Alistair's once imposing posture had crumbled under the weight of Michael Sinclair's influence. The maître d' had become a mere figurehead, his power no more than a shadow in the presence of the true force in the room. James could feel the shift in the air. The way people looked at him had changed too. Gone was the subtle disdain he had sensed earlier. Instead, there was something else. Respect. Whether they recognized Michael or not, there was no denying the change. Michael Sinclair had just tilted the scales in James's favor. He had gone from being a mere guest at the restaurant to someone who had the attention of the very elite who had once looked down on him. Alistair stood there, awkward and unsure of what to do next, while Michael looked at James, his eyes filled with something that felt almost like pride. Let's sit down, James, Michael said, his voice now calm and inviting. And just like that, the tables had turned. James wasn't the one being ostracized anymore. The balance of power had shifted, and Alistair knew it. The audience, both in the restaurant and in the narrative, watched in stunned silence as the man who had been humiliated only moments ago now found himself standing at the center of a powerful new reality. The night, which had begun with insult and rejection, had been transformed into something far greater, a moment of empowerment and the beginning of a new chapter. The evening had started with James feeling small, humiliated, and desperate. But now, everything had changed. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the air felt charged with anticipation. Every eye in the restaurant was now on James, Michael, and Alistair. The once comfortable dining establishment had become the backdrop for a confrontation that was set to redefine the lives of all involved. Alistair, the maître d', who had so confidently insulted James just hours before, now found himself on the defensive, struggling to hold on to the power he had long wielded over the patrons in the room. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier for him. James stood beside Michael Sinclair, the powerful CEO who had turned the tide in his favor. James was no longer the helpless figure he had been at the beginning of the night. He was determined, resolute, and ready to face the consequences of the conflict he'd been forced into. This wasn't just about one insult. It was about his dignity, his worth, and standing up against the injustices he had endured for so long. With a steady breath, James turned to Michael. Let's do this. It's time to take this to the next level. Michael gave a nod of approval. You've got this. Let's make sure Alistair and everyone here understands just how wrong he was. James walked toward the head table, where Alistair and the rest of the restaurant's elite were seated, now nervously watching James's every move. The high society patrons had no idea what to expect, but they could sense that something monumental was about to happen. James cleared his throat, making sure everyone in the room was paying attention. The hum of whispers slowly faded into silence as he raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm but firm, "tonight I've been treated with disrespect by this man." He pointed at Alistair, whose face had gone pale. "And I think it's time the truth came to light." The guests exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was unfolding. Alistair's composure was quickly slipping away, and James could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The maitre d' tried to maintain an air of confidence, but it was clear he was struggling. His eyes flickered nervously between James and Michael. "I'm sure you've all had a wonderful evening," James continued, "but I don't think many of you are aware of what goes on behind the scenes here. You see, this place, this restaurant, isn't just a luxury venue. It's a place where customers are treated like trash if they don't fit the mold of the elite." His voice became more passionate as he spoke, shaking off the remnants of doubt that had lingered earlier in the night. Alistair attempted to interject, but James raised his hand to silence him. "No, Alistair, I'm speaking now." He took a step closer, his voice growing stronger. "I want everyone to know how I've been treated, how people like me are ignored, disrespected, and cast aside simply because we don't look the part." A few of the patrons looked uncomfortable, but there was a growing sense of unease in the room. The air felt thick with tension as James made his declaration, knowing full well that the status quo was about to be shattered. "You see," James continued, "I wasn't always a wealthy man. I wasn't always someone who could afford a meal here. But what's worse than that, the way people like Alistair look at you when you walk in the door, the condescending tone, the assumption that you're out of place, that's the real poison here, and it's about time we do something about it." At this point, Alistair's facade had completely shattered. His face was flushed with anger, and his eyes were darting around the room, desperate for support. He attempted to stand up, but Michael Sinclair stepped forward, his commanding presence unmistakable. "Enough, Alistair," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "The game's over. You've crossed a line tonight that you can't undo. You've treated James with disrespect, and I won't stand for it." Michael's gaze was sharp, cutting through the room, and for the first time Alistair realized that he was no longer the one in control. As the room held its breath, Michael turned to James, a small smile playing on his lips. "Do you know what to do next, James?" James nodded, his resolve unwavering. "It's time to bring the truth to light." With that, James made a decisive move. "I am not just a guest here," he said loudly. "I've been an investor in this restaurant for over a year now. This place, this restaurant that you've all held in such high regard, is actually mine." He paused for dramatic effect, watching as the patrons reacted in shock. "I bought into it months ago, and now I'm calling the shots." The gasps of disbelief echoed through the room. The very people who had looked down on James were now staring at him in awe, realizing that they had underestimated him in the most profound way possible. Alistair's face contorted with disbelief, then anger, as he realized the true weight of James's words. "This restaurant is mine," James repeated, his voice strong and full of purpose. "And Alistair, you're fired. Not just from your position here, but from this world of privilege you've built for yourself. You're done." Alistair's face twisted in fury, but there was no room for argument. James's words had struck with surgical precision, and the power dynamic had shifted entirely. The moment hung in the air for several seconds as James watched Alistair's face go pale with shock and humiliation. The realization of his downfall hit him hard. The restaurant, his symbol of power, his playground, was now under James's control. The guests who had been silently observing began to whisper, some in disbelief, others in admiration for James's strength. James felt a sense of liberation wash over him. All the years of being overlooked, of being told he didn't belong, had led to this moment. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. no longer just a victim of circumstance, but a man who had taken control of his own destiny. As he stood there looking around the room at the people who had once turned their backs on him, he smiled, not in arrogance, but in quiet satisfaction. Alistair's defeat was complete, and in that moment James felt a deep, emotional release. The pressure that had been building inside him for so long, the anger, the frustration, the feeling of not being enough, melted away. He was victorious. Not because of the restaurant, not because of the wealth or power, but because he had fought back. He had stood up for himself and reclaimed his dignity. As Michael placed a hand on his shoulder, James looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. Michael gave him a reassuring nod. "You did this, James. All of it. You had the strength to take back what was yours." And with that, James knew that nothing could ever make him feel small again. As the evening came to a close and the last of the guests exited the restaurant, James stood alone in the quiet dining room. The once bustling space now felt eerily calm, but it wasn't just the silence that lingered. It was the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours. He had come into this place as an ordinary man, disrespected and humiliated, and he was leaving with everything he had ever dreamed of. Not just wealth, but respect, dignity, and the ability to shape his own future. But what struck James most profoundly was the realization that none of it mattered without a sense of self-worth. In that final showdown with Alistair, it wasn't the restaurant he was fighting for, it was his dignity. It wasn't the material wealth that had empowered him, but the decision to stand up for himself, to refuse to let anyone define his value. The transformation James had undergone wasn't just financial, it was internal. He had learned that his worth wasn't tied to how others saw him or to the status symbols of wealth and power. It wasn't about fitting into the mold that society had set for him. No, James had learned that true power came from within, from the knowledge that he was deserving of respect and that no one had the right to diminish him because of where he came from or how he looked. He thought about the waiter, the ones who had looked down on him, the sneers, the judgments, and the dismissals. In the past, he would have been crushed by such treatment, but now all he felt was resolve. They had failed to see his potential, his strength, and now they had to face the consequences of their arrogance. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people who had treated him as invisible were now forced to recognize him for what he truly was. A man who had earned his place not just by luck but through sheer will and persistence. As James stood there looking around the restaurant that now bore his name, he couldn't help but smile. He wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a man who had learned to value himself, who had reclaimed his self-worth in the most public way imaginable. And in that moment, he understood the deeper lesson. The true measure of success is not in how much you own or what people think of you. It's in your ability to stay true to who you are, to rise above the challenges that seek to break you, and to always remember that no one can define your worth except you. In the end, the story wasn't about James becoming a rich man. It was about him becoming the kind of person who knew how to stand up for himself, who understood that no one had the right to take away his dignity. This was the real victory. As the last remnants of the evening faded away, James stood at the entrance of the restaurant, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. He had achieved everything he had once thought impossible, but as his reflection stared back at him, a new thought began to form in his mind. What now? He had proved to the world, and most importantly, to himself, that anything was possible if you refused to let circumstances dictate your fate. But he knew that this story wasn't just his, it was a universal one. How many people had walked through life feeling unseen, dismissed, or underestimated? How many had been told they weren't enough because they didn't meet society's arbitrary standards? The truth is, everyone has the power to change their life's trajectory. Sometimes it just takes one moment, one decision, to flip everything upside down. James had seized his moment. He had recognized that no matter how many times life knocked him down, his worth would never be determined by someone else's opinion. And so James turned to face the camera, the lights on him now as bright as his newfound future. I've learned a lot through this journey. I've learned that no one should ever let someone else's judgment define who they are. I've learned that your self-worth is not something that can be given or taken away by anyone. It's something that belongs to you, and you alone. He paused, letting his words sink in. So, I want to leave you with this. What would you do if you had the power to turn your life around in just one moment? Would you stand up for yourself? Would you push back against the things that are holding you back? Or would you remain silent and let your dreams slip away? He smiled softly. The choice is yours. You hold the power to rewrite your story. And no matter where you start or what people think of you, your worth is something they can never take away. Then, with a final thought, he added, if this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Comment below and share your thoughts on what defines your worth. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire change, challenge the status quo, and remind us that we are all capable of greatness. James walked away from the camera, the weight of his journey behind him, and the future full of endless possibilities ahead.